All right. Did the Postal Service perform? Well, let me ask you this: did you look into how well they performed when it came to delivering election mail?
Yes, we've wrapped up that work. Our report has not yet been released, but generally we found that the Postal Service prioritized ballots effectively during the election.
Okay, well then let me go to the Postmaster General himself. How was the performance in delivering election mail?
Very proud of the performance of the 640,000 men and women of the Postal Service, and we did usual thing that we do every election, performed extraordinary measures. We delivered 99.7%. We have a report out that's on our website, 99.7% of ballots within 2 days. Some very, very extremely high numbers. I have it written down someplace here. But everything was in the 99%. Ballots to election, from voters to election boards were the 1.7 days, the average time, across 135 million ballots.
Let me follow up on the gentleman from Georgia's questions then to the two previous witnesses. Would you say with the let me quote the gentleman from Georgia, the almost perfect delivery of ballots in the previous election, given that fact, would you say that it was unconscionable that someone would dispute and vote to undo the results of that almost perfect delivery of ballots in the previous election? To either of the two previous witnesses. Let me just recount the facts. The gentleman from Georgia voted to undo the elections in two separate states. And so he has just spent about 5 minutes reminding us, in his own words, that the delivery of ballots was almost perfect by the United States Postal Service in that election that he voted to undo. So I'm asking you whether the evidence that you have supports that. Anytime now. Okay, reclaiming my time. I didn't think so.
The thing about Republicans who push the big lie is that when they try to absolve Postmaster General DeJoy and say that the election ballots had a near-perfect return rate, then it really does put on full display the fact that they then turned around and tried to throw those very ballots away. I mean, think about it. This is a hearing in which a Republican is cheering on the fact that more than 99% of mail ballots arrived, clearly suggesting that that is a good thing, and yet that very Republican voted to overturn Biden's win, which was the result of those very ballots whose arrival he's applauding. I'm not saying he's a hypocrite. Yeah, no, that's exactly what I'm saying. The Republican at the beginning of this clip is Congressman Jody Hice from Georgia, who voted to overturn the November 3rd election results, which would not only nullify the votes of over 35,000 Democratic voters in Clark County, Georgia, but 2.5 million Democratic voters in the state and over 81 million Americans. And beyond that, on January 6th, Hice urged his supporters to, quote, fight, and stated, quote, this is our 1776 moment, hours before thousands of Trump supporters stormed the U.S. Capitol building in an attempt to subvert the election. In fact, it was Hice himself who stood up and objected to the certification of the results while baselessly citing unlawful election changes in Georgia.
For what purpose does the gentleman from Georgia rise?
Mr. President, myself, members of the Georgia delegation, and some 74 of my Republican colleagues and I object to the electoral votes from the state of Georgia on the grounds that the election conducted on November 3rd was faulty and fraudulent due to unilateral actions by the Secretary of State to unlawfully change the state's election process without approval from the General Assembly, and thereby setting the stage for an unprecedented amount of fraud and irregularities. And I have signed the objection myself.
Only here's the thing. While Heist tries to claim that any changes made by Secretary of State Raffensperger to the state's election process without approval from the General Assembly was unlawful, that is a straight up lie. Why? Because this exact issue is already adjudicated. It was heard by a federal judge in a northern Georgia district court, where Lin Wood, one of the sycophant lawyers arguing on behalf of Donald Trump, claimed that the so-called consent decree, which basically allowed Raffensperger to notify people within 24 hours if their ballot was rejected, was an unconstitutional change of election law because the Secretary of State made the decision and not the General Assembly. But a judge ruled on this issue and affirmed the consent decree as legal, stating, quote, recognizing that Secretary Raffensperger is the state's chief election official, the General Assembly enacted legislation permitting him, in his official capacity, to formulate, adopt, and promulgate such rules and regulations consistent with law as will be conducive to the fair, legal, and orderly conduct of primaries and elections. The settlement agreement is a manifestation of Secretary Raffensperger's statutorily granted authority. In other words, the entire basis for Representative Heist's objection had already been litigated and adjudicated. That issue is already put to rest. So he's basically saying here that he knows better than the courts, and that even though this issue is already resolved, he'll still argue that the consent decree was illegal because it didn't fit into his preconceived partisan agenda. These people clearly don't care about the law, because if they did, they'd respect the branch of government whose job is to actually interpret that law. And by the way, just in response to these Republican efforts to rewrite history and paint Louis DeJoy as some kind of hero because more than 99% of election mail was delivered, the only reason that mail was delivered was because a federal judge, Emmett Sullivan of the U.S. District Court for Washington, D.C., ordered the USPS to immediately send postal inspectors to post offices in various cities and states across the country to sweep for any ballots that had yet to be delivered and send them out immediately. Those ballots weren't delivered because of Louis DeJoy, they were delivered in spite of Louis DeJoy. The ballots that remained at those facilities were there because his changes sent on-time delivery rates plummeting. So no, this wasn't some reflection of Louis DeJoy's impeccable leadership, it was a reflection of a court order to force the USPS to clean up DeJoy's mess. The simple fact is that Louis DeJoy tried to slow down the mail expressly because it was Democrats who were likely to vote using that method. That is why Donald Trump put him in that position, and DeJoy did exactly what was expected of him. And when that didn't work, people like Jody Heist stepped in and tried to invalidate those same ballots that DeJoy tried to prevent from arriving. Both of these men were complicit in a scheme to deprive tens of millions of Americans from having their voices heard in the last election. And in their otherwise insignificant place in history, this will be their only sorry legacy. While you're here, please check out my podcast, No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen. I take a deep dive into the top stories of the week, and I also interview major players in the world of politics, like Kamala Harris, Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Pete Buttigieg, Katie Porter, Al Franken, Cory Booker, Jamie Harrison, Mary Trump, and many more. Again, that's No Lie with Brian Tyler Cohen, available anywhere you listen to podcasts.